Eleanor Whitfield did not want to be at the garden party, and she had no intention of pretending otherwise. She stood near the edge of the lawn, away from the cluster of young women arranging themselves like flowers around the man everyone had come to see. The Duke of Ashcombe had not yet arrived, but his absence had done nothing to calm the crowd. If anything, it had made them more restless, each woman rehearsing her laugh, her posture, her practiced glance over one shoulder. Eleanor found the whole display exhausting. She had come only because her mother insisted, and because refusing would have caused argument neither of them had the patience for that morning. Grace Whitfield had spent the carriage ride reminding her daughter, in a voice sharpened by hope and worry in equal measure, that opportunities like this did not come twice. A duke, unmarried, searching for a wife, a family with more pride than money. The arithmetic was not subtle. Eleanor had nodded along without truly listening. Her mind was on the elderly woman she had spotted near the refreshment table, struggling to lower herself into a chair while a footman stood too far away to notice. She crossed the lawn without hesitation and offered her arm. "Allow me," she said. The woman, small and sharp-eyed beneath a wide hat, looked up in surprise. "That is very kind of you, dear. Most young ladies here are too busy watching the gate to notice an old woman falling over." "I was not watching the gate," Eleanor admitted, easing her into the chair. "No," the woman said, studying her with new interest. "I can see that." Eleanor smiled and turned to fetch a cup of lemonade, unaware that 20 feet away, near the hedge that bordered the property, a man in a plain gray coat had just arrived and was watching the entire exchange with an intensity that had nothing to do with lemonade. Julian Ashcombe had learned, over the course of one long and grinding season, exactly how much a person's manners change depending on who they believed was watching. He had tested this theory 49 times. Each test followed the same pattern. He would arrive at a gathering not as himself, dressed instead in clothing plain enough to pass for a steward or a distant cousin, someone unremarkable, someone forgettable. He would watch. Only once he had seen how a woman treated servants, elderly guests, people who could offer her nothing, would he reveal who he truly was, and allow the introduction his aunt had arranged weeks earlier. 49 times, the mask had cracked the moment a lady learned his identity. He had watched sweet smiles curdle into calculation. He had watched women who had ignored a struggling servant moments before suddenly transform into visions of gentle, selfless grace the instant they realized a duke was in the room. He had heard, more than once, the same women mock those very servants once they believed themselves unobserved again. It had left him with very little faith left to spend. His aunt, Lady Margaret, had warned him that this final name on the list, Eleanor Whitfield, was included more out of desperation than genuine hope. The Whitfields were respectable but unremarkable, their fortune thin, their standing modest. Lady Margaret had added the name simply because the season was ending, and the list needed one more. Julian had almost skipped the introduction entirely. Instead, he had come early, dressed as always in his plain coat, and positioned himself where he could watch the gate without being noticed. He had expected another performance, another woman craning her neck toward the entrance, waiting for a title to walk through it. Instead, he found a young woman with her back to the gate entirely, helping an old woman into a chair as though nothing else in the garden mattered. He watched her fetch the lemonade. He watched her return, kneel slightly so she could speak at eye level with the seated woman, and listen, actually listen, as the old woman began telling some long story about her late husband's roses. Eleanor did not glance toward the crowd once. She did not check who might be watching her be kind. She simply was kind, the way a person is kind when kindness costs them nothing to perform and everything to withhold. Julian felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. He watched for nearly 20 minutes before his aunt found him near the hedge, exasperated as always by his habit of skulking about his own social engagements like a thief casing a house. "You are meant to be presentable by now," Lady Margaret said, adjusting the strand of pearls at her throat. "The Whitfield girl arrived an hour ago. Have you even looked for her?" "I have been looking at nothing else," Julian said. Lady Margaret followed his gaze to where Eleanor sat beside the elderly woman, now laughing at something that had been said. "That one? Good heavens, Julian. She has barely spoken to anyone of consequence all afternoon. That is rather the point of the exercise, Aunt." Lady Margaret sighed the sigh of a woman who had given up trying to understand her nephew's methods years ago, but who trusted the results regardless. "Then go and be presented properly, before someone else claims her attention." Julian did not move immediately. He was not ready to become the Duke of Ashcombe again just yet. He wanted, selfishly, a few more minutes of being no one at all, A few more minutes of watching a woman be good, simply because goodness was who she was, not because she had an audience worth impressing. But the moment could not last forever. His aunt was already moving toward Eleanor, and there was nothing to do but follow. The introduction, when it came, was formal and brief. Lady Margaret performed it with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this 49 times already, presenting her nephew as though unveiling a prize at auction. Eleanor rose from her seat beside the older woman and offered a polite curtsy, her expression giving away nothing beyond ordinary courtesy. "Your Grace," she said. "It is a pleasure." There was no flutter in her voice, no sudden brightness in her eyes at the word grace. If anything, Julian thought he detected something closer to mild resignation, as though she had simply added one more obligation to an afternoon already full of them. "The pleasure is mine," Julian said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it more than he had meant the same words to the previous 49 women combined. Eleanor studied him for a moment, her gaze direct in a way that most women of his acquaintance avoided when facing a title. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I believe I saw you standing by the hedge earlier, in a gray coat." Julian felt his pulse catch. No one had ever noticed him during the test before. No one had ever noticed enough at the man in plain clothes to remember him once he reappeared in finer ones. "You have a sharp eye," he said carefully. "I have a sharp memory for people who watch a room instead of joining it," Eleanor said. "I find it curious behavior for a man who is, by every account, the very center of the room whenever he chooses to be." It was not flattery. It was closer to a challenge, delivered with the same steady calm she had shown the elderly woman minutes earlier. Julian found himself unable to summon a clever reply, an experience so unfamiliar that he simply laughed instead, short and genuine. "Perhaps," he said, "I find rooms more interesting when I am not the reason everyone is performing in them." Something flickered across Eleanor's face then, quick and thoughtful, gone before he could name it. "That is either the most honest thing a duke has ever said to me, or the most practiced line I have heard all season." "I suppose you will have to decide which," Julian said. "I suppose I will." The old woman, who had been watching this exchange with obvious delight, tugged gently at Eleanor's sleeve. "Introduce me properly, dear, before this young man decides I do not exist." "Your Grace, this is Mrs. Pembroke," Eleanor said. "She has been telling me about her roses." Julian bowed to the older woman with genuine warmth, and for the next several minutes the conversation moved easily between the three of them, roses giving way to gossip about the neighboring estates, gossip giving way to Mrs. Pembroke's opinions on the terrible state of modern manners. Eleanor contributed easily to all of it, her humor dry and unforced, never once steering the conversation back toward Julian's title or fortune, the way every other woman that season had managed to do within minutes. When Mrs. Pembroke was eventually claimed by another acquaintance, Julian found himself standing alone with Eleanor for the first time. "You did not ask me a single question about my estate," he observed. "Should I have? Every other woman I have met this season has asked me within 5 minutes." Eleanor considered this, tilting her head slightly. "I imagine that must grow tiresome. Being asked about your holdings instead of yourself." "You have no idea," Julian said, and the words came out more raw than he intended. Eleanor's eyes softened, just slightly, though her tone remained light. "Then I shall ask you something else instead. Do you actually enjoy gardens, Your Grace, or do you simply attend them because your aunt insists?" Julian glanced around at the lawn, the hedges trimmed into careful shapes, the roses arranged in beds too perfect to be anything but the work of a small army of gardeners. "Honestly, I find them rather dull. I prefer wild places, overgrown ones." "How disappointing for your aunt's guests," Eleanor said, and there was real amusement in her voice now. "I happen to agree with you. A garden this tidy always feels like it is trying too hard to be admired. And you dislike things that try too hard to be admired." "I distrust them," Eleanor corrected. "There is usually something being hidden underneath all that effort." Julian did not answer immediately. He thought of 49 women, of careful smiles and rehearsed laughter, of the particular hunger in eyes that had learned to calculate his worth before they had learned his given name. "You may be entirely correct about that," he finally said. The conversation was interrupted by Lady Margaret, who appeared at Julian's elbow with the pointed patience of a woman managing a schedule far tighter than her nephew realized. There were other guests to greet, other obligations to fulfill, and however much Julian wished to remain standing on that lawn, the rest of the afternoon would not organize itself. "Until we meet again, Miss Whitfield," he said, bowing. "Until then, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, offering a curtsy that was, if anything, slightly less formal than the one she had given at their introduction. As Julian allowed his aunt to steer him away toward a cluster of waiting guests, he glanced back once. Eleanor had already returned her attention to Mrs. Pembroke, laughing at something the older woman had said, entirely unconcerned with whether the Duke of Ashcombe was watching her walk away. For the first time in an entire exhausting season, Julian found that he minded very much. That evening, in the quiet of his study, he found himself unable to focus on the correspondence waiting on his desk. He kept returning, instead, to the image of Eleanor kneeling beside an old woman's chair, offering kindness that no one had asked her to perform, and no one had been positioned to reward. He thought of the 49 names on his list, each one now feeling like a smaller and smaller footnote. He thought of Eleanor Whitfield's steady, unimpressed eyes, and the way she had looked at him not as a duke to be won, but as a stranger to be assessed on his own uncertain merits. For the first time since he had begun this exhausting, humiliating experiment, Julian Ashcombe wondered if he had finally found the one name on the list that had never wanted to be on it at all. And somewhere beneath that thought sat a quieter, more dangerous one. He wondered what it would take to make certain she never found out just how carefully she had been tested. Eleanor did not think of the Duke again until 3 days later, when she nearly walked straight into him outside the milliner's shop. "Your Grace," she said, startled into a small step backward. "I did not expect to see you standing outside a hat shop, nor did I expect to be caught standing outside one," Julian admitted, and there was something in his easy grin that made Eleanor suspect he had in fact been waiting there on purpose, though she could not have said why she thought so. "Are you purchasing a hat, Your Grace? I am accompanying my aunt, who is currently inside arguing with the shop owner about the placement of a feather. I find myself grateful for any excuse to remain outdoors." Eleanor laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, quick and unguarded. "That sounds like Lady Margaret. She once spent 20 minutes at our parish fair debating the correct shade of blue for a church banner." "You know my aunt?" "Only by reputation. Everyone in the county knows Lady Margaret by reputation." Julian fell into step beside her without quite asking permission, and Eleanor found she did not mind. They walked together along the row of shops, the afternoon sun warm but not unpleasant, and the conversation moved easily from one subject to another the way conversations do between two people who are, without either quite admitting it, enjoying themselves. "I confess I did not expect you to remember the color of my coat from a single afternoon," Julian said eventually. "Most people barely notice a man standing near a hedge." "I notice most things," Eleanor said. "It is not always a comfortable habit." "Why is that?" She considered the question longer than he expected. "Because noticing things means you cannot pretend not to see them later. I noticed, for example, that you spent a good deal of that party watching people rather than speaking to them. I have wondered since whether that is simply your nature, or whether you were looking for something in particular." Julian felt a flicker of alarm beneath his calm exterior. She was closer to the truth than any of the previous 49 women had ever come, and she had arrived there without effort, simply by paying attention. "Perhaps I was looking for someone who would notice me noticing," he said, which was not quite a lie, though it was not the whole truth either. "That is a very roundabout answer, Your Grace. I have been told I give roundabout answers when I do not wish to answer directly." "At least you admit it," Eleanor said. "Most men simply lie and hope no one catches them at it." They had reached the end of the row of shops, where the street opened onto a small square with a stone fountain at its center. Eleanor slowed her pace, looking toward the water rather than at him, and Julian found himself studying her profile instead of answering. "May I ask you something personal, Miss Whitfield?" "You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." "Why do you dislike being paraded at parties the way I suspect you were paraded at that garden gathering?" Eleanor's expression tightened slightly, though her voice remained even. "Because it feels like being sold, Your Grace, and I have never enjoyed feeling like merchandise. My mother believes that securing a good match is the only measure of a woman's worth, and every party becomes another auction where I am expected to smile prettily and hope someone with money decides I am worth the trouble." "That sounds exhausting." "It is. I have watched my mother grow more anxious with every season that passes without a proposal, as though my unmarried state is a personal failure on her part, rather than simply the way my life has unfolded so far. I do not blame her for wanting security for me. I only wish security did not always seem to require pretending to be someone I am not." Julian was quiet for a moment, turning her words over carefully. He thought of his own season. 49 performances watched from behind a mask of plain clothing, 49 women transforming the instant they learned his title. He had assumed, without quite examining the assumption, that every woman in his circle was eager for exactly the kind of match Eleanor had just described with such weariness. "I think," he said slowly, that you may be the first person all season to describe this process honestly to me. Is that meant to be a compliment? It is meant to be gratitude, Julian said. I have grown tired of pleasant lies, Miss Whitfield. Yours, even when unflattering, are a relief. Eleanor glanced at him then, something searching in her expression, as though trying to determine whether his words were sincere or simply another version of the practiced charm she had grown so suspicious of. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, at least partly, because the corner of her mouth lifted into something close to a genuine smile. You are a strange sort of duke, Your Grace. I have been told that as well. Lady Margaret emerged from the milliner's shop at that moment, a hat box tucked under one arm, and an expression of triumphant satisfaction on her face, having apparently won her argument about the feather. She spotted Julian and Eleanor standing together near the fountain, and her eyebrows rose with obvious interest, though she said nothing beyond a polite greeting to Eleanor, before ushering Julian back toward the waiting carriage. As they rode away, Lady Margaret studied her nephew with a shrewdness that made Julian distinctly uncomfortable. You spoke with Miss Whitfield for quite some time. We happened to be walking in the same direction. For 20 minutes, apparently. Julian did not answer, watching the passing streets instead, and Lady Margaret allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She is not like the others, his aunt observed. I noticed it myself at the garden party, though I confess I did not think much of it at the time. She spent the entire afternoon speaking with an elderly widow instead of pursuing the guest of honor. That is precisely why I noticed her. Then perhaps, Lady Margaret said, you ought to stop noticing her from a distance and actually court the girl properly, before some other family recognizes what you have already recognized and claims her first. Julian did not respond, but the words settled uncomfortably in his chest because he knew his aunt was not entirely wrong, and yet he was not ready to abandon his careful distance either. He had learned, over one long and grinding season, exactly how quickly warmth could curdle into calculation once a woman understood the full scope of what she stood to gain. He was not yet willing to risk that transformation with Eleanor, not when her indifference to his title was the very thing that had drawn him to her in the first place. Better, he decided, to continue as he had begun. To let her know him first as a man in a plain coat, engineered chance meetings and careful conversations, before revealing the full weight of what a match between them would actually mean. It did not occur to him, not yet, that this plan required a kind of deception every bit as dishonest as the performances he despised in the women he had tested. Over the following 2 weeks, their paths crossed with a regularity that Eleanor found increasingly difficult to attribute to coincidence, though she said nothing of her suspicions aloud. She encountered Julian at church, seated near the back where he could easily be missed by anyone not specifically looking for him. She encountered him again in the park, walking without apparent purpose along the same path she favored each morning. She encountered him a third time at a small musical evening hosted by a family she barely knew, an invitation that had arrived, she later learned, only after Lady Margaret had quietly suggested it to the hostess. Each time, Julian behaved as though their meeting were entirely unplanned, and each time, Eleanor found herself enjoying his company more than she had any right to expect. They spoke of books, and Eleanor discovered that Julian read far more widely than his reputation suggested, hiding a genuine fondness for poetry beneath a public persona of dry practicality. They spoke of family, and Julian learned that Eleanor's father had died when she was young, leaving her mother to manage a household on an income that grew thinner each year, a fact that explained a great deal about the anxious pressure Grace Whitfield placed on her daughter's prospects. They spoke of nothing in particular, the easy, meandering conversation of two people who had stopped performing for each other and started simply talking. It was during one of these conversations, seated on a bench near the park's small pond, that Eleanor finally voiced the question that had been building in her for days. Why do you keep finding me, Your Grace? Julian considered lying. He considered the practiced deflection he had used successfully so many times before, but something about the directness of her gaze made deflection feel suddenly cowardly. Because I enjoy your company, he said instead. More than I have enjoyed anyone's company in a very long time. That is a rather large admission for a man who barely knows me. I know you better than you might think, Julian said, and immediately regretted the strange weight in his own voice. Eleanor studied him carefully. That is an odd thing to say. Is it? You speak sometimes as though you are keeping a secret, Your Grace. I noticed it the very first day we met, and I have noticed it several times since. I do not know what it is, and I will not press you to tell me before you are ready. But I would ask you not to lie to me outright, whatever it is you are hiding. Julian's chest tightened with something close to guilt. He thought of the plain gray coat hanging in his wardrobe, of the careful, deliberate way he had engineered every one of their supposedly accidental meetings, of the test she did not know she was still, in some sense, undergoing. "I would never lie to you outright," he said, which was, at least, technically true. Eleanor did not look entirely convinced, but she let the matter rest, turning her attention instead to a pair of ducks paddling across the pond's still surface. The moment passed, gentle and unforced, but it left a small, uncomfortable seed in Julian's chest, one that would not stop growing no matter how firmly he tried to ignore it. He realized with growing unease, running out of ways to justify the distance between the man Eleanor believed she was coming to know and the man he actually was. That evening, walking home alone through streets grown quiet with early evening, Julian found himself thinking not of his fortune, nor his title, nor the long list of obligations that came attached to both. He thought instead of the particular way Eleanor's expression softened when she spoke of her father, the dry humor she wielded like armor, the fierce, quiet pride that refused to bend even under the weight of her mother's anxious expectations. He thought, too, of society's growing curiosity. Word had already begun to spread that the Duke of Ashcombe had been seen repeatedly in the company of an unremarkable Whitfield girl, and speculation, as it always did in circles like his, moved faster than truth ever could. Eleanor's mother, he suspected, would soon hear the rumors, if she had not heard them already, and the pressure on Eleanor to formalize whatever this was would only grow heavier with each passing week. Julian did not know, walking home in the fading light, whether he was ready to give her the honesty she deserved, or whether he would continue hiding behind careful half-truths until the truth found its own way out, in whatever form it chose, at whatever cost it demanded. He only knew that for the first time in a very long season, he was afraid of losing something before he had even properly claimed it. The letter arrived on a gray morning, tucked among the usual correspondence, and Julian recognized the handwriting before he had even broken the seal. It was from Edmund. He set it aside unopened for nearly an hour, staring at it across his desk the way a man stares at an old wound that has never quite finished healing. When he finally opened it, the contents were exactly what he expected, a request for money, wrapped in enough false warmth to make the request seem like an act of family loyalty, rather than the same tired demand Edmund had made a dozen times before. Julian folded the letter and set it in the drawer where he kept the others, unanswered, and allowed himself, for the first time in months, to remember exactly why he had built the elaborate test that had governed his entire miserable season. 3 years earlier, Julian had been engaged. Her name had been Isabel Grant, the daughter of a well-regarded family with connections stretching across half the county, and Julian had believed, with the particular foolishness of a young man newly in love, that she wanted him for himself rather than for what he represented. She had been clever and beautiful and endlessly charming, and Julian had spent the better part of a year convinced he had found something rare and true. He had not yet inherited his title at the time. His father, though ailing, was still alive, still holding the estate together through sheer stubbornness, and Julian had been, at that point, merely the heir, a distinction that mattered a great deal to people who understood the arithmetic of inheritance far better than Julian himself did. He had discovered the truth by accident, arriving early to a meeting with his father's solicitor and overhearing a conversation not meant for his ears. Isabel, it turned out, had grown impatient with the pace of his father's decline. She had begun meeting privately with Edmund, Julian's own cousin and second in line for the title, discussing what would happen should Julian's father die before the wedding took place, discussing, in cold and practical terms, which of the two cousins represented the safer investment. Julian had stood outside that door for nearly 10 minutes, listening to the two people he trusted most in the world calmly weigh his worth against his cousin's, as though he were livestock being appraised at market. He had ended the engagement within the week. Isabel had wept, had insisted the conversation had been misunderstood, had sworn her devotion with the same fluent charm that had once won his heart so completely. Julian had not believed a word of it. Edmund, for his part, had never bothered to apologize at all, treating the entire affair as an unfortunate business arrangement that had simply failed to close. His father died 8 months later. Julian inherited the title, the estate, and a distrust so deep it had reshaped the entire architecture of how he approached every relationship since. The test had begun that same season. 49 women, each one required to prove their character before they were permitted to know his true worth. Julian had told himself in the years since that the test was simply prudence, simply the reasonable caution of a man who had learned an expensive lesson. He had not allowed himself to examine how much of it was also, quietly, a kind of punishment, both for the women he tested and for himself. He thought of all this now, staring at Edmund's letter in the drawer, and found his thoughts turning inevitably to Eleanor. She did not know any of it. She knew nothing of Isabel, nothing of Edmund, nothing of the careful architecture Julian had built around his own heart to prevent it from being wounded the same way twice. She knew him only as a man who appeared, with suspicious regularity, in places she happened to be, a man who asked careful questions and gave roundabout answers, and seemed, at times, to be carrying some unspoken weight he had no intention of sharing. Julian closed the drawer, rose from his desk, and decided, not for the first time, that he was not yet ready to burden her with the full truth. Not the truth about Isabel, and certainly not the truth about the test itself, the 49 names, the careful, calculated distance he had maintained from every woman in the county for 3 long years. He told himself this was protection. He did not yet allow himself to consider that it might also be cowardice. Eleanor, meanwhile, carried her own history, one she guarded just as carefully, though for different reasons entirely. Her father had died when she was 12, a sudden fever that took him within a week, leaving Grace Whitfield to manage a household and a daughter on an income that shrank a little further with each passing year. Eleanor remembered her mother's grief transforming, over time, into something closer to anxious calculation, every decision measured against the question of how the family might secure its future without a man at its head. By the time Eleanor turned 18, that calculation had settled firmly onto her own shoulders. There had been a courtship, 3 years earlier, with a young gentleman named Henry Aldridge, the second son of a modest but respectable family in the neighboring county. Eleanor had liked him well enough, had allowed herself, cautiously, to imagine a future with him, and had watched that future dissolve within a single afternoon when Henry's family discovered exactly how thin the Whitfield fortune had become. The engagement, unofficial though it had been, ended with a politely worded letter that spoke of changed circumstances and mutual understanding, phrases that meant nothing except that Eleanor had not been worth the risk once the numbers had been properly examined. Henry himself had not even written the letter. His mother had. Eleanor had cried for exactly 1 night. By morning, she had made a private, unshakable decision that would govern every relationship she formed from that point forward. She would never again allow herself to appear eager for anyone's approval. She would never again perform charm in the hope of being chosen. If a man wanted her, he would have to want the woman she actually was, unpolished and unperformed, or he could want nothing at all. It was this decision, more than any natural indifference, that had made her behavior at the garden party seem so remarkable to Julian. She had not ignored the crowd gathering around the Duke because she lacked ambition or interest. She had ignored it because 3 years earlier, she had learned exactly how quickly interest could be withdrawn once its object proved insufficiently valuable, and she had built her entire manner since then around never again being caught hoping for something that might be taken away. She had not told Julian any of this. She had told almost no one, beyond her mother, who had absorbed the news of Henry's withdrawal with a grim, practical acceptance that had somehow hurt worse than sympathy would have. Grace Whitfield's anxiety about her daughter's prospects had only sharpened in the years since, and by the time rumors of Eleanor's growing acquaintance with the Duke of Ashcombe began circulating through the county, that anxiety had reached a fever pitch entirely of its own. "You must not let this opportunity pass you by," Grace said one evening, seated across from Eleanor in their modest parlor, her needlework abandoned in her lap. "A duke, Eleanor. Do you understand what that would mean for this family?" "I understand perfectly well, Mother." "Then why do you speak of him as though he is simply an acquaintance? The whole county is talking. Lady Ashcombe's own household has been seen extending invitations specifically to ensure you and the Duke cross paths. This is not accidental, Eleanor. This is intention." Eleanor set down her own needlework, choosing her words carefully. "I am aware that his attention appears intentional, Mother. I am not aware of what that intention actually is, and I do not intend to chase after an answer simply because the possibility of a title has made you anxious for one." "Anxious," Grace repeated, her voice sharpening. "Yes, Eleanor, I am anxious. I have watched this family's fortune shrink for 11 years. I have watched you turn down 2 respectable introductions this season alone, because you found the gentleman in question, and I quote, uninteresting. I am running out of seasons in which to see you settled, and you speak of a duke's attention as though it were an inconvenience to be managed rather than the answer to every prayer I have said on your behalf since your father died." Eleanor felt the familiar tightness rise in her chest, the particular combination of guilt and stubbornness that always accompanied conversations like this one. She loved her mother. She understood, better than her mother perhaps realized, exactly how much fear lived beneath every anxious word. But she would not, could not, allow that fear to dictate how she behaved toward a man who had not yet given her any honest reason to trust him beyond his own company. I will not pretend eagerness I do not feel, simply to secure a match, mother. Not for you, not for this family's fortune, not for anyone. If the Duke wishes to court me honestly, he may do so, and I will consider him honestly in return. But I will not chase him. I have learned that lesson already, and I do not intend to learn it twice. Grace's expression softened, just slightly, the memory of Henry Aldridge passing visibly between them, though neither spoke his name aloud. I only want you settled, Eleanor. Settled and safe. I do not want you to end this season the way you ended that one. I know, mother. Then promise me you will at least try. Eleanor did not answer immediately, thinking of Julian's careful half-truths, the strange weight he seemed to carry beneath every conversation, the sense she could not quite shake that there was something significant he had not yet told her. I will try to be honest, she finally said. I will not promise more than that. It was, in the end, the same promise Julian was quietly failing to keep on his own side of their careful, unfinished acquaintance, though neither of them yet understood how closely their private fears mirrored each other, nor how much damage those fears would eventually cause once the truth, inevitably, found its way into the light. That same week, Edmund Ashcombe arrived unannounced at Julian's townhouse, dressed in clothing slightly too fine for a man who claimed, in every letter, to be facing financial ruin. "Cousin," Edmund said, settling into a chair without invitation. "I hear you have finally found a woman worth the trouble of an actual courtship. The whole county is speaking of little else. I did not invite you here to discuss my private affairs." "No," Edmund agreed easily. "You never invite me anywhere at all these days. I simply arrive." Julian regarded his cousin with the careful, guarded distance that had governed their relationship since the day he had overheard Isabel's voice through a closed door. "What do you want, Edmund?" "The same thing I always want. A small advance against my inheritance, should the title ever pass to me, which I understand grows increasingly unlikely now that you seem intent on securing an heir of your own. You understand correctly." Edmund's smile did not waver, though something colder moved behind his eyes. "Tell me, cousin, does this Whitfield girl know about Isabel? Does she know how carefully you have been testing every woman in the county before allowing yourself to trust a single one of them? I have heard whispers, you understand. 49 names, they say, though the exact number varies depending on who is gossiping." Julian felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That is none of your concern." "Perhaps not," Edmund said, rising from his chair with the same unhurried confidence he brought to every conversation. "But I imagine it would be very much Miss Whitfield's concern, should she ever learn the truth of how carefully she has been observed and evaluated before you allowed yourself to court her properly. Women tend to dislike discovering they were an experiment before they were a choice." He left without waiting for a response, and Julian sat alone in his study for a long time afterward, Edmund's words circling in his thoughts with an unwelcome persistence. He knew, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that his cousin's visit had not been idle gossip. Edmund never did anything without calculation, and the pointed mention of Eleanor, of the test, of the very specific fear that had governed Julian's every careful step since the garden party, felt less like an accident and more like a warning, or a threat. Julian did not yet know which, but he understood, sitting alone in the gathering dark of his study, that the careful architecture he had built to protect himself was beginning, slowly and dangerously, to crack. The invitation to Lady Caro's autumn ball arrived at the Whitfield household on a Tuesday, and Grace Whitfield nearly dropped her teacup when she saw the seal. "The Caros never invite us," she said, turning the card over twice as though the address might change. "Eleanor, do you understand what this means?" Eleanor understood exactly what it meant, though she said nothing of her suspicions to her mother. Lady Caro was a close friend of Lady Margaret's, and invitations to her events were coveted precisely because they rarely extended beyond the county's oldest and wealthiest families. The Whitfields, respectable as they were, had never before merited a place on that particular list. She did not need to ask who had arranged it. The ball itself proved to be exactly as grand as its reputation promised, the ballroom lit by more candles than Eleanor had ever seen gathered in a single room, the air thick with perfume and orchestra music and the particular electric tension of 100 conversations happening at once. Eleanor stood near the edge of the dance floor in a gown that had been remade twice from an older one of her mother's, acutely aware of how easily she could be picked out from the crowd as someone who did not quite belong among the silks and jewels surrounding her. She spotted Julian across the room within minutes, surrounded by a cluster of guests eager for his attention, and felt a small, unwelcome pang of something she refused to name as jealousy. He found his way to her within the half hour, extracting himself from the crowd with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to managing social obligations, and Eleanor found herself smiling despite her earlier irritation. "You look as though you would rather be anywhere else," Julian observed, offering his arm. "I look as though I am the only person here without a title or a fortune to recommend me," Eleanor corrected. "Which is, I believe, an accurate assessment of the situation. You recommend yourself perfectly well without either. That is a very generous thing to say, in a room full of people who would disagree with you." Julian's expression sobered slightly. "Let them disagree. I have grown rather tired of caring what this particular room thinks of anything." They danced once, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of every eye that followed them across the floor, the whispers that trailed in their wake like smoke. She had grown accustomed to being overlooked at gatherings like this one, and the sudden shift in attention sat uneasily on her shoulders, a weight she had not asked for and was not entirely certain she wanted. It was during the second dance, this one with a different partner entirely, that Eleanor first properly met Charlotte Vane. Charlotte was beautiful in the particular, polished way that came from years of careful training, her golden hair arranged in a style that must have taken her maid hours to perfect, her smile warm and immediate as she introduced herself during a pause between sets. "Miss Whitfield," Charlotte said, her voice pleasant and light, "I have heard so much about you this season. It seems everyone has, given how frequently your name appears alongside a certain gentleman's. I am not certain what you have heard, Miss Vane, but I suspect much of it is exaggerated." "Perhaps." Charlotte's smile did not waver, though something calculating moved briefly behind her eyes. "I was, myself, one of the ladies the Duke considered earlier this season. Did you know that? Before you arrived on his radar, there was quite a long list of us." Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral, though the words landed with more force than she wanted to admit. "I was not aware of any list, Miss Vane." "Oh, but there was. Quite a formal one, I understand, though the details were always kept rather mysterious. 49 of us, or perhaps 50, depending on who is counting. All of us evaluated and found wanting, one after another, until apparently you came along." Charlotte's tone remained light throughout, almost friendly, which made the words themselves land all the more unpleasantly. "I only mention it because I would hate for you to be caught unaware, should the truth ever surface more fully. Some women prefer to know exactly where they stand." "I appreciate your concern," Eleanor said carefully, "though I confess, I am not certain what to make of it." "Make of it what you like," Charlotte said, her smile widening just slightly. "I only thought you deserved to know. We were all tested, you understand, in ways we did not consent to, and were not told about until it was already finished. I simply thought a woman as sensible as you appear to be might want the same information the rest of us were denied." She drifted away before Eleanor could formulate a response, leaving behind a knot of unease that settled deep in Eleanor's chest and refused to loosen for the remainder of the evening. Eleanor did not confront Julian that night. She told herself she needed time to consider what Charlotte had said, to weigh malice against truth, jealousy against genuine warning. But the seed had been planted, and over the following days, she found herself replaying every conversation she and Julian had shared since the garden party, searching each one for evidence of the careful, calculated distance Charlotte's words had suggested. She thought of his roundabout answers. She thought of the strange weight he seemed to carry beneath every exchange, the sense she had voiced aloud, weeks earlier, that he was hiding something significant. She thought of how perfectly engineered their supposedly accidental meetings had always felt, in retrospect, now that she allowed herself to examine them honestly. Grace Whitfield, unaware of the doubt taking root in her daughter's chest, continued her own campaign with undiminished enthusiasm. "You must accept his next invitation without hesitation," Grace insisted one morning over breakfast, having heard, through the county's efficient gossip network, that the Duke had requested permission to call on Eleanor properly. "This is precisely the kind of attention we have hoped for all season." "I will accept the invitation, Mother, because I wish to speak with him directly about something." "Something troubling you?" Eleanor hesitated, unwilling to voice her suspicions before she had confirmed them for herself. "Merely a question I would like answered honestly." Grace studied her daughter with the particular sharpness of a mother who had learned, over many years, to read the things her children did not say aloud. "Eleanor, whatever doubts you are entertaining, I would ask you to consider them carefully before you act on them. A man's attention, once withdrawn, rarely returns." "I am aware of that, Mother," Eleanor said, thinking of Henry Aldridge, of the polite letter that had ended her last courtship without so much as a proper conversation. "It is precisely because I am aware of it that I refuse to proceed without honesty this time." I would rather lose his attention now, over an honest question, than lose it later, after investing far more of myself than I can afford to lose twice. Grace did not fully understand her daughter's reasoning, but something in Eleanor's steady, unwavering tone convinced her not to argue further. Julian, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware of the doubt growing on the other side of their acquaintance. He arrived at the Whitfield household 3 days after the ball, dressed formally for the first time in one of Eleanor's presence, having finally secured her mother's permission for a proper, sanctioned visit rather than another carefully engineered accident. He found Eleanor waiting in the modest parlor, her expression composed but unusually distant, and felt, before she had said a single word, that something between them had shifted. "Miss Whitfield," he said, bowing formally, "I confess I am relieved to finally call on you through proper channels, rather than relying on fortunate coincidence. Are they truly coincidences, Your Grace?" The question landed with more weight than its simple phrasing suggested, and Julian felt his easy smile falter, just slightly. "I am not certain I understand your meaning." "I think you understand perfectly well," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but steady. "I met Miss Vane at Lady Caro's ball. She mentioned a list, Your Grace. 49 names, she said, perhaps 50. Women evaluated and tested before you allowed yourself to court any of them honestly. I would like to know whether that is true, and if it is, I would like to know exactly what role I have played in whatever experiment you have been conducting all season." Julian stood very still, the careful architecture of half-truths he had maintained for weeks collapsing all at once beneath the weight of her direct question. He thought of a dozen ways to deflect, to soften, to explain away Charlotte's words as jealous exaggeration. He found, standing in the Whitfields' modest parlor, that he could not bring himself to lie to her again. "It is true," he said quietly, "all of it." Eleanor's expression did not change immediately, though something behind her eyes went very carefully still, the particular stillness of a person absorbing a blow they had already half expected and were still, somehow, entirely unprepared for. "I see," she said. "Eleanor, please, let me explain." "You may explain, Your Grace," Eleanor said, rising from her seat with a composure that cost her more than Julian could have guessed. "But I would ask that you do so honestly, from the very beginning, and I would ask that you understand, before you begin, that I am unlikely to forgive easily whatever it is you are about to tell me." Julian nodded, understanding, for the first time with full clarity, exactly how much damage his careful, self-protective silence had already caused, and how little time remained to repair it before it cost him something he had only just begun to realize he desperately did not want to lose. Julian told her everything, standing in the modest parlor while afternoon light moved slowly across the worn carpet, and Eleanor listened without once interrupting. He told her about Isabel, about the conversation he had overheard through a closed door 3 years earlier, about the particular, sickening clarity of hearing two people he trusted calmly weigh his worth against his cousin's. He told her about Edmund, about the letters requesting money that arrived with grim regularity, about the visit that had ended with a pointed, calculated threat disguised as idle gossip. He told her about the test itself, the plain gray coat, the careful, deliberate positioning at the edge of every gathering where he might observe a woman's true character before she ever learned who he truly was. He told her about 49 names, each one a fresh disappointment, each one confirming the same painful lesson Isabel had first taught him. He told her finally about the garden party, about watching her help an elderly woman into a chair without once glancing toward the gate, about the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had settled in his chest and had not left him since. "I told myself I was protecting both of us," Julian said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its usual practiced ease. "I told myself that if I revealed the truth too soon, you would begin performing for me the way every other woman had. I told myself the deception was necessary, even kind, a way of ensuring whatever grew between us was genuine, before it was tested by my title." "And did it never occur to you," Eleanor said, her voice carefully controlled, "that deceiving me was its own kind of dishonesty? That watching me, unaware, evaluating me against 49 other women I never knew existed, was precisely the same violation you claim to have suffered at Isabel's hands?" Julian had no answer for this. He had turned the question over privately in the days since Edmund's visit, and he had arrived, uncomfortably, at the same conclusion Eleanor had just spoken aloud. "You are correct," he said simply. "I see that now, though I confess I did not see it clearly until this very moment." "That is not a comfort to me, Your Grace. I did not expect it to be." Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the small, unremarkable garden behind her family's home, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though holding something together by force. Do you understand what it means, to learn that every conversation we have shared, every moment I believed was simply two people getting to know each other honestly, was in fact still part of some larger evaluation? I do not know, standing here, which parts of our acquaintance were genuine, and which parts were simply another stage of your test. All of it was genuine, Julian said, taking a step toward her before stopping himself, uncertain whether he had any right to close the distance between them. The test ended the moment I met you at that garden party, Eleanor. Everything since then, every conversation, every walk, every moment I sought out your company, was simply me, wanting to know you, nothing more calculated than that. How am I meant to believe that, when you have already proven yourself capable of exactly this kind of careful, sustained deception? It was a fair question, and Julian found he had no immediate answer that would satisfy either of them. I do not know how to prove it to you, he admitted. I only know that it is true. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally turned back to face him, her expression had settled into something colder and more distant than he had ever seen from her before. I would like you to leave, Your Grace. Eleanor. I am not asking you to leave forever, she said, her voice steady despite the effort it clearly cost her. I am asking you to leave now, so that I might think clearly, without your presence complicating my judgment further. I would ask that you not call again until I have sent word that I am ready to receive you, and I would ask that you respect that request, whatever your own feelings on the matter. Julian bowed, formal and stiff, every instinct urging him to argue, to explain further, to close the distance she had so carefully placed between them. He did none of these things. He recognized, with painful clarity, that any further pressure now would only confirm every doubt she had just voiced about his willingness to respect her without an agenda attached. As you wish, he said quietly, and left. The following weeks passed slowly for both of them, though in very different ways. For Eleanor, the days settled into a strange, uncomfortable rhythm. She resumed her ordinary routines, visiting Mrs. Pembroke, walking the familiar paths near the park, sitting with her mother in the evenings over needlework that neither of them fully attended to. But beneath the surface, calm ran a current of anger she had not expected to feel so sharply. Anger not only at Julian but at herself, for having allowed herself to trust so completely, so quickly, after swearing 3 years earlier that she would never again make herself vulnerable to exactly this kind of disappointment. Grace Whitfield, sensing the shift in her daughter's mood though not understanding its cause, approached the subject carefully. Has something happened with the Duke? We are not currently speaking, Mother. Eleanor. Please, Mother. I do not wish to discuss it further at present. Grace, to her credit, did not press the matter, though the worry in her expression deepened with each passing week that brought no further word from Ashcombe House. Charlotte Vane, meanwhile, seemed to take particular satisfaction in the rumors that inevitably began circulating once observers noticed the sudden absence of the Duke from Eleanor's company. She made a point of seeking Eleanor out at a small gathering held 2 weeks later, her expression arranged into careful, performed sympathy. I did try to warn you, Miss Whitfield, Charlotte said, settling beside Eleanor with the particular satisfaction of a woman who believed herself vindicated. I hope my honesty at the ball did not cause you too much distress. I only thought you deserved to know the truth before you invested yourself further. I appreciate the warning, Miss Vane, however it was delivered. Of course, I understand it must be difficult, being cast aside after everyone believed you had secured his attention so thoroughly. Though I suppose it is some comfort, knowing you were simply the 50th in a long line of disappointments, rather than any particular failing on your part. Eleanor studied Charlotte carefully, noting the careful cruelty wrapped so precisely inside apparent kindness, and found herself, unexpectedly, thinking of her own earlier judgment of the Duke's deception. Tell me something, Miss Vane, Eleanor said, her voice calm despite the sting of the other woman's words. When you learned of the test, of the 49 names before mine, did it occur to you that the Duke's behavior, however wrong, came from a place of genuine wounding, rather than simple cruelty? I do not excuse what he did. I have told him myself that his deception was unacceptable, but I find myself wondering whether you take such particular pleasure in sharing this information because you believe it protects other women, or because you were once one of the 49, and this is the only power available to you now. Charlotte's composed expression flickered, just slightly, before settling back into place. That is an unkind thing to say, perhaps, Eleanor said, but I have found, recently, that unkindness delivered honestly is often less damaging than kindness delivered with a hidden purpose. Charlotte did not respond to this, excusing herself shortly afterward with rather less grace than she had arrived with, and Eleanor sat alone for a long moment afterward, turning over the strange, uncomfortable realization that had surfaced during their exchange. She was angry with Julian. That anger was genuine, and she did not intend to dismiss it simply because she had, in the same breath, defended him to Charlotte Vane. But she recognized, sitting alone in the quiet corner of a gathering she had not particularly wanted to attend, that her anger was not quite the same as certainty that everything between them had been false. Julian, during those same weeks, occupied himself with a task he had avoided for 3 years. He wrote to Isabel Grant. The letter was brief, formal, and carefully worded, requesting nothing beyond a single meeting, an opportunity to finally close a chapter he had spent 3 years refusing to properly examine. Isabel, now married to a wealthy merchant's son in a neighboring county, responded with surprising promptness, agreeing to receive him the following week. The meeting itself proved shorter and less painful than Julian had expected. Isabel, older now and considerably less charming than his memory had preserved her, spoke of the affair with a kind of weary honesty that surprised him. "I was frightened, Julian," she said, seated across from him in her modest, comfortable parlor. "Your father was dying, and no one could say how long the estate might take to settle, or what debts might surface once it did. I was young and foolish and terrified of being left with nothing, and Edmund offered a kind of certainty you, in your grief, could not provide at the time. I am not proud of what I did. I have thought of it often, in the years since, and I do not expect your forgiveness. I only offer you the truth, since you have asked for it." Julian absorbed this quietly, feeling something shift and settle inside him that he had not expected to feel. "Thank you for your honesty. May I ask why you have come, after 3 years of silence?" Julian considered the question carefully. "Because I have recently done something rather similar to what you did to me, though for different reasons, and I find I owe someone an apology I do not yet know how to properly deliver. I thought perhaps understanding your side of things might help me understand my own actions more clearly." Isabel studied him with something close to sympathy. "Then I hope, whoever she is, that she is more forgiving than you were with me." Julian left that meeting with a clarity he had not possessed in 3 long years. He understood, finally, that Isabel's betrayal had been born of fear rather than pure calculation, a distinction that did not excuse her actions but did, at last, allow him to release some of the anger he had carried since. More importantly, he understood that his own test, however well-intentioned, had inflicted a version of the same wound on 49 women who had done nothing to deserve his suspicion, and on Eleanor most of all, the one woman who had never once tried to win him and had been rewarded, for her honesty, with secret evaluation and careful deception. He did not know if Eleanor would ever forgive him. He knew only that he owed her the truth, offered without condition, without a test hidden behind it, without any further attempt to manage or control how she responded. He wrote to her that same evening, a single short letter requesting nothing beyond permission to call, and waited, with a patience that cost him more than he had expected, for whatever answer she chose to send. Eleanor's answer took 9 days to arrive, and when it finally did, it consisted of a single line, written in her careful, unhurried hand. "You may call on Thursday, if you still wish to." Julian read the note perhaps 20 times before Thursday arrived, searching each word for some hint of what awaited him, and found nothing beyond the plain, unadorned honesty that had first drawn him to her at that garden party months earlier. He arrived at the Whitfield household precisely on time, dressed simply, deliberately choosing not to arrive with any of the practiced polish he had once relied on to charm rooms full of strangers. He wanted, whatever happened in the next hour, for Eleanor to see him exactly as he was, without performance, without careful calculation, without a single remaining test left to hide behind. Eleanor received him in the same modest parlor where the truth had first been spoken between them, and Julian noted, with a small ache in his chest, that she had chosen to sit rather further from him than she once had, a physical distance that mirrored the emotional one still standing between them. "Thank you for allowing me to call," Julian said, remaining standing rather than seating himself uninvited. "I have thought a great deal about what I wanted to say to you," Eleanor said, her voice steady, though her hands, Julian noticed, were folded rather tightly in her lap. "I am still angry, Your Grace. I want you to understand that clearly before we proceed. I do not think that anger is unreasonable, and I do not intend to pretend it has resolved itself, simply because 9 days have passed. I would not ask you to pretend anything, Eleanor. I have had quite enough of pretending for both of us." Something in his tone, stripped entirely of its usual careful charm, seemed to catch her attention, and she studied him more closely than she had since he arrived. "I met with Isabel Grant," Julian continued, before he could lose his nerve. "The woman I was once engaged to, before my cousin and her mutual arrangement ended it. I had not spoken to her in 3 years. I went, after our last conversation, because I finally understood that I owed you more than a simple confession, Eleanor. I owed you an honest accounting of why I built the test in the first place, and I could not give you that honestly until I understood it myself. Eleanor said nothing, waiting, and Julian found himself grateful for her patience even as it unsettled him. I built the test because I was afraid, he said. Afraid of being valued for my title rather than myself, the way Isabel valued my cousin's steadier prospects over my own uncertain grief. I told myself the test protected me from ever feeling that particular humiliation again. What I did not understand, until very recently, is that the test did not actually protect me from anything. It simply ensured that I inflicted the same wound on every woman I encountered, evaluating them in secret, deciding their worth before they had any say in the matter at all. I did that to you, Eleanor, even after I had already decided you were the one woman all season who deserved it least. That contradiction sat in me for weeks before I was finally forced to examine it honestly, and I am deeply sorry it took me this long to do so. Why are you telling me this now? Because I do not want to offer you another performance, Julian said. I do not want to arrive with flowers and careful speeches designed to win you back the way I once tried to win every room I entered. I wanted, instead, to offer you the truth, plainly, without any remaining test hidden behind it, and to let you decide honestly what you wish to do with it. I am not asking you to forgive me today. I am only asking you to know, clearly and without doubt, exactly who you are speaking to. Eleanor rose from her seat slowly, crossing to the window, where afternoon light fell in a soft, uneven pattern across the worn carpet. She was quiet for a long moment, and Julian did not press her, understanding, finally, that patience was the only honest gift he had left to offer. I spoke with Miss Vane again, after our last conversation, Eleanor said eventually, still facing the window. She took a certain pleasure in reminding me that I was simply the 50th name on your list, the last in a long line of women found wanting. I told her that I did not believe your test, however wrong, came from cruelty. I believed, even then, that it came from a wound you had not yet learned how to properly close. She turned back to face him. I did not say that to defend you, Your Grace. I said it because it was true, and because I have never been able to make myself believe something simply for the sake of comfort, even when comfort would have been easier. Then you believe I am telling you the truth now? I believe you are trying to, Eleanor said carefully. I am not certain that is quite the same thing as trusting you fully again. Trust, I have found, is rebuilt slowly, through actions repeated over time, not restored instantly through a single honest conversation, however well-intentioned. That seems fair to me. Does it? Eleanor's eyebrow rose slightly, the first flicker of her familiar dry humor returning to her expression. I half expected you to argue the point, Your Grace. You have not struck me, until recently, as a man inclined toward patience. I have had a great deal of practice these past 9 days, Julian said, and something in his voice, wry and self-deprecating, drew a small, reluctant smile from her. I am not offering you an answer today, Eleanor said, her expression sobering again. I want that understood clearly. I am willing to allow you to call again, properly, without any test remaining between us, and I am willing to see whether the man standing in front of me now is the same man I believed I was coming to know before Miss Vane's revelation. But I will not promise more than that, and I will not chase you, Your Grace, any more than I have ever chased anyone's attention. If this is to continue, it will continue because you choose to earn it honestly, one ordinary day at a time, not because I have decided in advance to forgive you, simply because a title stands to be lost otherwise. I would not want it any other way, Julian said, and meant it more fully than he had meant almost anything else in his life. I have spent an entire season testing women to determine whether they wanted me for myself or for my title. I find now that I am the one being tested, properly, honestly, for the very first time, and I intend to earn whatever answer you eventually decide to give me. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, something unguarded finally surfacing beneath her careful composure. That is either the most honest thing you have ever said to me, Your Grace, or the most practiced line I have heard all season. You will have to decide which, Julian said, echoing, deliberately, the very words she had spoken to him on the day they first met. Eleanor's smile, when it finally came, was small and reluctant and entirely genuine. I suppose I will. He did not stay long that first Thursday, understanding instinctively that pressing further would undo whatever fragile ground they had just carefully rebuilt. But he returned the following week, and the week after that, arriving each time without a plain gray coat, without any hidden test, without any careful architecture designed to protect himself from being known too fully. Slowly, over the weeks that followed, the easy warmth between them began to return, though it arrived differently this time, tempered by honesty rather than performance. Eleanor watched him carefully in those weeks, noting how he behaved not only toward her but toward the people around them, the way he greeted her family's modest household staff with the same genuine respect he offered visiting nobility, the way he spoke of Isabel and Edmund without bitterness now, simply as painful chapters he had finally allowed himself to close properly. Grace Whitfield, observing the slow rebuilding of her daughter's relationship with the Duke, wisely chose not to interfere, though her relief was evident in every gentle smile she offered whenever Julian's carriage arrived outside their modest home. It was nearly 2 months after that difficult Thursday conversation, on an ordinary afternoon with no particular occasion attached to it, that Julian finally asked the question he had been quietly building toward since the moment he had watched a young woman help an elderly stranger into a chair without once glancing toward the gate. They were walking together near the same pond where Eleanor had once asked him why he kept finding her, the autumn air crisp and bright around them, when Julian stopped and turned to face her directly. "Eleanor, I am not going to offer you a test," he said. "I am not going to ask you to prove anything to me, and I do not want you to prove anything in return. I am simply going to ask you plainly, without any hidden architecture behind the question, whether you would consider becoming my wife." Eleanor did not answer immediately, studying him with the same steady, unimpressed gaze that had first caught his attention months earlier, though something warmer had settled behind it now. "What happens," she asked slowly, "if I never learn to chase anyone's attention, including yours? I have built my entire manner around never appearing eager for anything I might lose. I do not know if marriage changes that instinct, Your Grace, or if I will simply carry it with me into whatever life we build together." "I would not want you to change it," Julian said. "It is precisely why I am asking you now, instead of any of the 49 women who spent an entire season chasing mine. I do not want a wife who performs eagerness for my benefit. I want a wife who tells me the truth, plainly, whether or not it is convenient, exactly the way you have done since the very first afternoon I watched you from behind a hedge." Eleanor's expression softened into something Julian had not seen from her before, unguarded and quietly certain. "Then I suppose," she said, "you had better ask me properly, Your Grace, without any further speeches attached." Julian laughed, surprised into it, and knelt beside the pond where they had once spoken so carefully around the truth neither of them was ready to share. "Eleanor Whitfield, will you marry me?" "Yes," Eleanor said, simply and without hesitation, the word arriving not as performance, but as plain, unadorned honesty, exactly the kind she had demanded from him from the very beginning. "Though I would ask, Your Grace, that you never again test me for it." "I never will," Julian said, rising to take her hand. "You have already taught me everything I needed to learn about what honest affection actually looks like. I do not intend to forget the lesson." They stood together beside the pond as the afternoon light began its slow fade toward evening, two people who had each spent years guarding themselves against exactly this kind of vulnerability, finally choosing, deliberately and without condition, to risk it together. News of the engagement spread through the county faster than either Julian or Eleanor anticipated, and with it came a fresh wave of attention neither of them particularly welcomed. Edmund arrived at Ashcombe House less than a week after the announcement, his expression carrying none of its usual careless confidence. He found Julian in the study, going over wedding arrangements with a patience that would have surprised anyone who had known him during his long, guarded season of testing. "You are truly going through with it," Edmund said, settling into a chair without invitation, as was his habit. "The Whitfield girl, I confess I did not expect you to recover from Isabel quite so thoroughly." "Her name is Eleanor," Julian said, not looking up from his papers, "and I would ask you to use it properly, if you intend to remain welcome in this house." Edmund's eyebrows rose at the unfamiliar firmness in his cousin's voice. "You have changed." "I have learned a few things, Edmund, chief among them, that I no longer intend to let fear of being valued for my title govern how I treat the people around me, yourself included. I know what you attempted, mentioning Eleanor and the test in the same breath, hoping the threat of exposure might loosen my purse strings a little further. It very nearly worked, in its own way, though not in the manner you intended." Edmund shifted uncomfortably. "I meant no real harm by it." "Perhaps not," Julian said, "but you very nearly cost me the one relationship in my life built on complete honesty, and I find I am not inclined to forget that easily. I will continue to assist you, Edmund, as family, within reasonable limits." But I will not be manipulated again, by you or by anyone else who believes my fear of being valued only for my fortune makes me an easy target. Edmund left, shortly afterward, considerably more subdued than he had arrived, and Julian returned to his wedding arrangements with a lightness in his chest that surprised him. He had spent 3 years allowing his cousin's careless cruelty to feed his deepest insecurities. Setting a clear boundary, however overdue, felt like closing one final door on a chapter he had already begun to leave behind. Charlotte Vane's reaction to the engagement proved rather different, though no less telling. She approached Eleanor at a small gathering held to celebrate the upcoming wedding, her expression arranged into the same careful performance of warmth Eleanor had come to recognize. "I must offer my congratulations, Miss Whitfield," Charlotte said, "though I confess I am somewhat surprised. I did not expect the Duke to settle so soon after everything came to light." "Thank you, Miss Vane. I do hope you understand what you are taking on. A man capable of testing 50 women so thoroughly is not, I think, a man easily changed." Eleanor considered her words carefully before responding, remembering the strange, unexpected sympathy she had extended toward Charlotte during their last difficult conversation. "I do not believe he needed changing, Miss Vane. I believe he needed someone willing to tell him the truth honestly, and to hold him accountable when he failed to offer the same in return. I intend to keep doing exactly that, for as long as we are married." Charlotte's smile faltered slightly at the quiet confidence in Eleanor's tone. "How very modern of you." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "though I have found, recently, that honesty tends to work rather better than performance, however unfashionable that makes me." Charlotte did not linger long after that exchange, and Eleanor found she felt no particular triumph in the encounter, only a quiet, settled relief that she had not allowed the other woman's careful cruelty to shape her own behavior the way it once might have. The wedding itself took place on a bright morning in early spring, held in the same small parish church where Eleanor had first spotted Julian standing near the back, deliberately positioned where he could easily be missed by anyone not specifically looking for him. This time, he stood at the front, in full view of everyone gathered, with nothing hidden and nothing held in reserve. Grace Whitfield wept through most of the ceremony, though her tears, for once, carried none of the anxious calculation that had governed so much of her daughter's courtship. Lady Margaret sat beaming in the front pew, taking no small satisfaction in having added Eleanor's name to a list that had once seemed like little more than an afterthought. Mrs. Pembroke, seated near the back with a cluster of other elderly guests, leaned toward her neighbor during the vows and remarked, with evident satisfaction, that she had known from the very first afternoon that something genuine had passed between the young woman helping her into a chair and the strange man watching from behind a hedge. Eleanor and Julian settled, in the months following their marriage, into a life neither of them had quite expected, but both found they preferred to anything they might have imagined during that long, guarded season before they met. Julian dismantled the last remnants of his careful testing apparatus entirely, choosing instead to build his judgments of character through ordinary, patient observation rather than deliberate deception. Eleanor, for her part, found that marriage did not require her to abandon the guarded instincts that had protected her for so long, only to gradually loosen them, one honest day at a time, in the company of a man who had finally learned to earn her trust rather than assume it. They did not speak often of the test, or of Isabel, or of the 49 names that had come before Eleanor's own. When the subject did arise, usually prompted by some careless remark from a distant acquaintance still fascinated by the story's more dramatic details, Julian answered honestly and without embarrassment, treating the whole difficult chapter as exactly what it had become, a painful lesson finally, properly learned. Eleanor, for her part, found herself thinking less and less of Henry Aldridge and the polite letter that had once taught her never to appear eager for anything she might lose. She had married, in the end, a man who wanted her precisely because she had never chased him, and she had learned, slowly and carefully, that allowing herself to want something openly did not automatically mean losing it. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Julian gave her a small, unremarkable gift, wrapped without ceremony, containing nothing more than a plain gray coat, folded neatly inside a simple box. "I do not need it anymore," he explained, when Eleanor looked at him with evident confusion. "I thought perhaps you might like to keep it somewhere, as a reminder of the man you first met behind that hedge, before either of us knew we would end up here." Eleanor turned the coat over in her hands, remembering the particular sharpness with which she had first noticed him watching, unaware, from the edge of a garden party neither of them had wanted to attend. "I think," she said slowly, "I will keep it in the attic, somewhere out of sight, exactly the way its owner used to prefer standing, Julian laughed, the sound easy and unguarded, and Eleanor found herself laughing with him. Two people who had each spent years testing the world's honesty from behind careful distances, finally standing together in plain sight, without any remaining test between them at all.